to, apart from thanking you all for participating either as sponsors or directly as growers. Without either sponsors or growers, we really can't expect this programme of research to deliver, and I personally believe that it is one of the most powerful ways that we can learn as a community. Grower to grower learning on field scale experiences is fantastically powerful, and it gets more powerful as we get more entries and more participants over years. So whilst we're only in year 2 and there are some really interesting things coming out of it already, it really is an exciting prospect for future years, and I would urge everybody to find the wherewithal within themselves to continue participating. So that's enough from me. Shona Duffy, PGRO, is about to present the season that we've had from the perspective of the yen. The whole meeting should be over by 1 o'clock. That includes chat at the end, and I hope it's a good one, and please enjoy yourselves and don't be shy. Shona.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger. I'm going to start off today talking about the weather. It's one of those things that affects all of us, but there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. But so just to kind of have a quick look at what the weather did from the autumn onwards. The autumn was mixed, actually. You can see from the little graph there that the southeast of England seemed to have a bit of a battering over the autumn, and that led to some crops not going in, which led to maybe a slight increase in beans being sown in the spring, which should have been sown in the winter. So it was all a bit of a mixed bag, really, the autumn. Moving into the winter, that was pretty wet, actually. You can see there, if you hadn't got your winter beans in by the time we got to winter, there was pretty much no chance, which left growers in a position where they were hoping and praying for a much better spring. Coming out of the winter, we were slightly concerned that the soils would maybe be a little bit waterlogged, and they were to begin with, but they did dry up pretty quickly. We had temperatures which were above the normal, and the rainfall was about normal, maybe a little bit less, and that gave us a lot of opportunities in the spring to get on, get crops in, and get things going. Moving on to the summer. Oh, that was a funny summer, really. We had June and July, which were pretty warm. Rainfall was a little bit below average, but the difference there was in the southeast of England. They actually got quite a hammering, and a lot of crops were lost because of excess rainfall there. If we think about the months in general, when we really wanted to crack on and get so I'm finding it very distracting seeing all this lobby stuff coming up on the screen. Yeah, so the sunshine in the summer, we had 107% of average, greater than average sunshine in June. July was 111%, but in August it dipped down to 79%. So when we wanted it to be nice and dry to get on with our harvesting, it just wasn't, the opportunities weren't there, and that's led to increased moisture in the harvested product. Going on to the next slide, thank you. There you can see, and I'm sure this will be brought up in someone else's presentation, just the kind of where all the yen entrants were, and broken down between spring beans and winter beans. There's about twice as many spring beans as there are winter beans. Look at the next slide, thank you. So how did all this weather affect the establishment? With the challenging wet winter, there were a few drilling windows available, but they were quite narrow, especially in the southeast, like I suggested. establishment was good, but it did lead to some winter waterlogging in places, which led to some patchy crops, particularly in headlands where the drainage wasn't so good. In the spring, there was much better soil conditions than we actually expected for getting the spring beans in, and a longer window of opportunity. It basically didn't rain, as far as I can make out, from the middle of March all the way through to the middle of May, which left a lot of growers plenty of opportunity to get crops in. However, a problem did occur. There's a picture there of a very late sown spring bean crop, which didn't capitalise on the moisture. They've been waiting for it to dry up. But of course, it just dried a little bit too quickly. And this was a direct drilled crop. You can see the beans just sitting there in the slots created by the drill. Fortunately, the rain came in the middle of May, and that was able to rectify the problems that we saw there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Weed control. Now, with a dry spring, the problem occurs that none of the herbicides really get the activation that they require. But the upside of that is there were a lot fewer weeds about as well, because they just didn't get the opportunities to germinate. However, with the heavy rain that occurred in the middle of May, that increased the potential for the weeds to then have a second flush. So it was a bit of an issue there. And we also saw, and you'll just see this picture here, kind of bleaching around the edge of the leaves from some crops, not all crops. This is particularly relevant to chromosome. So it's just been sitting there in the topsoil, waiting to do its thing, with no rain really to activate it. And then heavy rains come, it just pushes the herbicide down to the root zone and encourages a bit of take up by the plant. It's not a major thing, and the plants will grow away from it, but it can be a little bit alarming when you see it to begin with. Okay. So diseases, there's always winners and losers in every year, and that's very much dependent on what the weather does. We did see some downy mildew early on in some winter beans, and again in some spring, but it wasn't much of a problem once the weather improved. That sort of rectified itself. The incidence of foot rot was higher compared to what years. What the beans don't really like is big deluges of rain, and we certainly saw that over the year. Chocolate spot was a lot lower though compared to previous years, which if you're thinking about whether to put on a second fungicide or a third fungicide, that certainly has an impact. And rust, we didn't really see much rust this year because August was so dull, and that just kind of kept that in check. Just to draw your attention to these two pictures on your right hand side of your screen. We rarely see Ascochyta in the field these days. It's very much kept in control by the testing that's done in all the seed. But we quite often see now Cercospora, which does at first glance look a little bit similar to Ascochyta. Obviously, if you have any doubts as to what you think it might be, or whether you ought to control it, then just please send a sample in to us and we'll have a look at it in the crop clinic. Thank you. Pests, because we had quite a cold spring, sorry, I should have mentioned that in the weather review, we had a very cold, frosty spring. There was more frost in April than there has been in any year in recent memory. That seemed to keep the weevils in check this year, and with much lower numbers than we would have normally expected. Nematodes, you'll see the picture of the crop here. This is nematodes in action. There was a much bigger increase. Last year there was only between 10 and 15% of crops coming through, plants coming through our crop clinic, which tested positive for nematodes. This year that is up. We had 22% of crops coming through our lab which tested positive for nematode, and that's really to do with the wetter conditions in the soil. Nematodes are able to move freely, and that creates more of an issue. Aphids, although every year is an aphid year, just a slightly different emphasis on when they come in and what they do. There was slightly lower evidence of aphids and virus incidents within the crop this year. Bruchid, now this is something we look at within the yen, and you'll see this in your reports. Incidence of Bruchid was a little bit lower than it was in 2020. You can see from the pictures there what the little beast looks like. And if you look very closely in kind of May time, you can see they've been starting to lay their eggs on the pods there. I don't know how obvious that is, but anyway. Next slide, please. And this was all the so this is all of the yen samples that came through, and whether they had Bruchid or not. Quite a few didn't have samples. Interestingly, some in the south of the country, and it does seem to suggest that there's a bit of a hotspot around PGRO. I can't really comment on that, but that's just how the results look in this particular year. Thank you. Next slide. But just to say that Bruchid was down a little bit this year. Just to say thank you all for being part of the yen. We couldn't really do any of this without you. Big thanks to Tom. I know you worked really hard to turn this around and get this online in the last 24 hours, so well done to you. And we look forward to working again with you in 2022.
So we'll circle back round to interpreting the reports. Hopefully this might be useful because it might give a bit of context to people for looking at their reports when we come back round to Dan. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, all the sponsors, all the entrants, PGRO, everybody at ADAS for helping us build our data set over the last 3 years, and the data that you've all returned this year is really good. We're going to try and make it even easier to submit data in the future, but we're really excited to share what we're learning so far, or what we think we can see from this analysis. So we have 50 entrants registered by the close of 2021. 42 of you guys return yields, which is really good. Shona's talked about the split of spring and winter beans we've had in 2021, and we have 51 yields from 2019 and 2020, the first 2 years of the bean yen, to add into our data set. And you know, you might see that 42 plus 51 equals 93, not 92, and that's because we've had a late yield that didn't make it into the data set analysis. So we'll cover this a bit more in detail as we go on, but we've got a really good widespread of data in the bean yen. So far, when we look for associations with yield, we don't see any differences between latitude or longitude. We do see differences, but we don't see any kind of ongoing associations with latitude or longitude or weather with yield so far. So one reason I'm really grateful for everybody's input into the bean yen is that we've now been able to move on to a more sophisticated type of statistical analysis. So those that joined us in 2020 will remember that we had a preliminary look at the data set by splitting the data into lower 50% of yields and higher 50% of yields and testing the differences between the two. But now that we've got more data, we're able to do this thing called a REML, which allows us to look at the effect sizes of various different factors on yield. And this is exciting because it allows us to do it with not only data that we have kind of numerical data for, such as nutrition and plant physiology components such as seeds per metre squared. We're also able to now do statistical tests on the effects of choices that are made throughout the season, such as what type of agronomy people have applied. One thing to note when we go through this analysis and when we think about the effect size is that what it means is that we start off with an average yield, and the effect size is the association of that factor with an increase or decrease in yield. So one thing to note is that the effect size doesn't start at 0, and this might be a bit easier to discuss when we have a look at some as we go on. We always give health warnings when we do our statistical analysis, and we have to note that we can't disentangle cause and effect when we look at this data, so we can't say what's driving yield. So we can say some factors are associated with high yields, but we can't say it's because that factor has been changed that we see this change in yield. There's lots of different factors that are interacting in this data set, but if we combine it with our expert judgment and hopefully a discussion that we'll have a bit later on, we can attempt to pull out some useful messages. Another thing to note is just because a factor is not highlighted in the analysis doesn't mean it's important. So we all know that plant nutrition and things like that are important, and it could just be that people are keeping across the yen, are keeping a really good management of certain factors. So we're not seeing extremes within the data set, so we're not seeing associations. So it's just worth pointing out that just because something hasn't come out in our analysis doesn't mean that it's not important for this crop. One limitation of the REML analysis so far is that it's difficult to separate out spring and winter bean varieties. So when we look at the REML analysis, spring and winter varieties are combined together. To try and have a look at the difference between spring and winter beans, we have partitioned the data set into top 25% and bottom 25% of yields, like we have done in previous years. One thing also to note about how we've managed the analysis of spring and winter beans is that we've done this by variety type rather than sowing date. And the reason for this is that we don't have an exact sowing date for all of the crops that we've analysed in the bean yen so far. And why this is important, for example, in 2020, we had a lot of winter varieties that were actually sown in the spring. So that's just worth bearing in mind if you see any kind of sowing dates that are in the spring when it says a winter variety. So moving on, I'm going to go through a lot of tables, and we'd really like to get some active discussion as we go on through this. So if anybody's got any questions, anybody thinks anything that particularly surprising, or if it matches up with what they've seen personally on farm, then yeah, please put questions in the chat, or put your hand up and we'll take any questions. So yield potentials overall. So this is our spring and winter bean yield potentials. We didn't see any association within our REML analysis of yield with yield potential. So that suggests to us that we can refine our yield potential a bit further, but also it's possible to get good yields across the UK. We didn't see any significant associations with soil organic matter, but we did see a negative association of clay content with yields across the bean yen dataset. So when we talk about effect sizes, this is what I mean. So starting at the average crop in the bean yen, for every increased percentage of clay content, that's associated with a decrease of 0.03 tonnes per hectare of yield. Obviously, there's not really much you can do about your soil type, but we thought this is interesting to highlight because we can think about how we what factors soil type might then be leading into to affect yield. So is clay content increased increases are associated with decrease of yield. Silt content increases are associated with an increase in yield, as we might expect. We didn't see any associations with pH across the data set or soil available water capacity, and we estimate soil available water capacity based on the soil information that you give us, which includes depth to rock, soil type, stone contents, and that's what goes into your potential yield model. But we haven't seen any associations with that in the data set so far. We haven't seen any clear weather effects in the Bean Yen data set so far to be associated with yield. So this is what I was talking about, how it's quite exciting that we're able to do this more sophisticated analysis. We're now able to better test the effect of different practices on yield in the Bean Yen. So to summarise some of these practices, I've just added in a pie chart of the bottom 50% of yielding entries and the top 50% yielding of entries, and the REML analysis has been applied to this data as well. All in all, we did see some associations with manure use, which maybe Dan might be able to give a bit more information on, but we haven't seen anything consistently. And if you look at the pie charts, the blue segment is where no manure has been applied in the recent history, and you can see it's about the same in the bottom and top 50% of entries. So nothing super strong coming out of there. We haven't seen any effects of cultivation strategy, and you can see that again in both the bottom 50% of yields and the top 50% of yields, plough-based cultivation strategies account for about a third of entries. We didn't see any associations with cover crop history, and we didn't see any effects of previous crop or drill row width. So the vast majority of entries in the Bean Yen were following a cereal crop, and most of these were following winter wheat, and it's about 60% in the both bottom and top 50% of entries. We didn't see any significant difference between winter and spring varieties, and this is going back to what I was talking about, how we classified winter and spring crops by varieties rather than sowing date. So between those two variety types, there wasn't any clear associations with yields, or in other words, whether a winter variety or a spring variety was used overall across the Yen, that didn't seem to explain much of the yield variation. And you can see here from these pie charts, the blue segment are the winter beans, and in both the bottom and top 50% of yields, it's about 30%. We did see a negative association of seed rate with yield, but we need to think about this a bit more carefully, because what happened, especially a lot in 2020, a lot of people already had winter beans that they weren't able to put in the ground before Christmas, and so these were sown at generally a higher rate in the spring, which is advised for planting winter bean varieties in the spring, and therefore that might account for some of the association of lower yields with higher seed rates. We'll talk a bit more about seed rates as we get on and plant populations, but that's something to bear in mind as we look at the data for now. So nutrition. So we've tried to summarise the soil nutrition, the fertilisers applied, and the grain nutrition that we've seen to be associated with yield. And if you look at soil phosphorus, as perhaps not surprising, it doesn't come out when you partition the data set into the top 25% and bottom 25% of entrants, but when you apply the REML, which accounts for all of the data, we saw that lower P indexing soils of 0 and 1 were lower yielding. We didn't see any significant associations with soil K or soil Mg. One thing to note about soil K and soil Mg is that we haven't included the 2021 data in this. And this is because, as you might have seen from your reports or in the newsletters, that we need to be a bit careful about how we interpret the K and Mg soil values, because they've been done with a different chemical test than has been done in previous years. So this data here is just the 2019 and 2020 data. We didn't see any positive associations with the amount of phosphorus applied with the yield, but it might be that people are applying the right amount of phosphorus for their crop. But we did see a significantly positive association with the amount of potassium applied. So that's both in the partition analysis, which we've highlighted here in red, and in the REML. So the lower 25% of yields on average applied around 10 kilos per hectare K2O, and the top 25% of entrants applied on average 34 kilos per hectare. Sulfur applications, this didn't come out as significantly associated with yields in our REML, but one thing that is worth noting, when you look at the raw data, quite a few of the bottom 25% of yields applied no sulfur, and that makes it a bit tricky to apply stats because zeros are quite difficult to deal with in the statistical world. But if you look at the means, although not significantly different, you can see that there is generally more sulfur applied in the high yielding entries that we've had. We didn't see any significant associations with grain phosphorus, but we did see a significantly, well, almost significantly positive association with grain potassium. And that's nice because that reflects what we've seen in the applications. And so what this means is that for each 0.1% increase in grain potassium above the average, that was associated with a 0.25 tonnes per hectare increase in yield. So again, if anybody's got any points or comments that they'd like to put in the chat as we go along, perhaps about nutrition, if there's anything surprising, then please add it in. Yeah, Roger's added a good point there about why we've compared the bottom and top 25% of yields for the nutrition, but not for the cultivation and agronomy data. And that's simply just because how we've summarized the data. We're not actually able to carry out stats using the partition analysis on that kind of categorical data. But so we didn't actually apply any stats to that bottom 50% and top 50% of entrants, but we were able to do in the REML. So for those pie charts, it's more to kind of just show the spread of the data, but I agree, perhaps could narrow it down a bit more by moving to 25% categories instead. Martin's added a good comment about whether it's possible to run the sulfur analysis without the zero application entries. And I might pass that question over to Dan, because one thing that I haven't noted is that Dan has been working really hard to run the REML analysis for this. And a lot of this is hot off the press, you would say. So I'm happy to pass that question over to Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, I think that's the way I've done it, or I've looked at doing it with categorizing it. So just looking at whether there was some sulfur or no sulfur. So looking at it as a factor, and I can't see any effect there. So however I'm looking at it in the REML, I can't find a big effect of sulfur. But like Tom says, there are a lot of people who aren't applying any, but there isn't any evidence in the data that those people who are applying, some are, are the ones who are achieving higher yields, if that makes sense. Whereas for for potassium, that is coming through.
Thanks, Dan. So what's also exciting about where we've got to with the data analysis is that we're able to look at categorize things and run stats in them, as Dan has just mentioned. So for micronutrient applications, if you take categories of no micronutrients applied, at least some micronutrients applied and an unknown amount of micronutrients applied, perhaps because people haven't returned that piece of information, we see that there's a significant association of yields being higher in the sum category rather than the non-category. And there's also a significant association of this with grain protein as well as yield. I don't know, Dan, whether you want to kind of add anything else on there about the micronutrient analysis.
No, so we haven't only done a kind of just like I say, a quick look-see on this at the moment, and and that it's interesting it's coming out because it took a long time for that to come out in the cereals data set, and in some instances it still hasn't come out as clearly as what it has in this data set already. But we can, where we've got information on those micronutrients, we can start to look at that in terms of a yes, no, was it manganese, or I don't think we haven't necessarily got enough information to know exactly what was applied, but knowing what micronutrients were applied, I think is something that we can look at a bit more.
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan's mentioned before, we didn't see any associations of phosphorus or sulfur. When we categorised by stimulant applications, we didn't see any differences there. When we look at leaf tissue analysis, we haven't seen any associations with yield. I think one point to make there is that leaf tissue analysis is something that we're trying to look at more generally and see about how leaf nutrient profiles increase and decrease over the season, and that's something that we'd like to look at in the bean yen data set. But so far, when you just look at the amount of different nutrients in the leaves at growth stages, we haven't seen any associations with yield. But there might be a bit more of a complex story as leaf nutrients increase and decrease as crop development goes on. And summarised, we haven't seen any other associations of grain nutrients with yield other than in grain potassium. So crop development,
Tom, Tom, you have a question about types of sulfur that we used. I don't know if you want to address that before you move on.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Roger. So types of sulfur, I must admit that when I did this analysis, or when I was doing my part of the analysis, that I was just looking at the rates of sulfur applied rather than the products. I don't know, Dan, whether you I don't know whether we have collected in recent years the product of sulfur applied.
Yeah, I don't think we are getting it at the moment. Obviously, with all this stuff, there's a kind of a real balance between not wanting to put you guys, under so much, getting so much, extracting so much information out of you that takes for you forever to give it all to us, versus kind of getting enough. So I think at the moment we're only kind of getting rates of sulfur rather than necessarily products, unless kind of someone's chosen to give it to us separately. But that's something that we could maybe look at.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and thank you to everybody for kind of putting questions in the chat. It's really good to have this discussion, so please continue doing so. So crop development, this is basically what we do with all the information of growth stages that you give us. As we've mentioned, we've categorized winter beans and spring beans by variety rather than sowing date. So you may see some things that look on first inspection surprising when we talk about different split up spring beans and winter beans. So just to remind you that the REML analysis is done on all of the data. So this gives us associations across the data set so far, and this splitting up of the data into top and bottom 25% of yields, that's to help us think a bit more about differences between spring and winter varieties. So if you look at the data set overall and you run a REML analysis, then we get a very close to significant effect of sowing date on yield. And this is a negative association, so late sown crops overall negatively associated with yield. And this follows down into the date of growth stage 34 or nodulation. So if you take the data set as a whole, for an average crop, for every day that nodulation is later, that was associated with 0.02 tonnes per hectare decrease in yield. As we mentioned at the beginning, we do have some confounding factors of different variety types being sown at different time in the year, depending on what was available in terms of drilling windows that season. So that might be impacting some of these associations that we see here. But overall, late sowing dates associated with lower yields. When we look at the data set overall, we don't see a significant association with harvest date, but if you split it out and do quite a simple test on the date of harvest for our winter bean varieties, there was a significant association of the higher yielding entries being harvested later. We didn't see any significant associations with the duration of sowing to growth stage 34 or the season length in general, so the date of sowing to the date of harvest. But you can see from the averages that generally the season length seems to be higher in the higher yielding entries, although that's not come out as significant in the statistical analysis. So crop management associations as yield. So this, we've used your agronomy form data to do this analysis. And again, I'm going to bring Dan on during this slide to talk a bit more about these associations. But if you look at the number of fungicide applications, we did see a significant association of the number of fungicide applications being associated with high yield. So for each, on the average crop, for each application of fungicide, this was associated with 0.6 tonnes per hectare yield increase. We'll talk about this a bit more later, and you can see that when you split out the bottom 25% of yields to the top 25% of yields, you can see that on average the top 25% of yields had 2 and the bottom 25% yields had 1.4 fungicide applications. We do see a similar story for the number of insecticide applications, although this didn't come out as significant in our REML. Fungicide spend was significantly associated with yield. For every pound spent on the average crop, this was associated with 0.016 tonnes per hectare increase in yield. We do have to think about cause and effect in these, so we can't just say directly that applying more fungicides equals more yields. It might be an indication of just overall better disease and pest control, but it is interesting to see that these positive associations are coming out. Overall crop protection spend, we didn't see any significant associations. So one thing that Dan has been working very hard to do is to take all of the data of observations that you give us about observed weed problems, observed pest damage, and observed disease problems, and put those into the analysis to see if they associate with yield. And for all of those three things, we do see negative associations of your observations of those problems with the yield. So Dan, I don't know if you want to add a bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I thought that was interesting because we've got actually quite good data from some of you on this in terms of where, and over the 3 years where you've been quite good at telling us if there's a disease problem. We changed the way that we did it a little bit in this last year because without asking lots more times, but kind of in a little bit less kind of detail. But the right, we're having a score if you like, but just have you got a weed problem or have you not got a weed problem? Actually, it's kind of those people who have said they've got a weed problem is the people who have said they've got a weed problem overall are 1 tonne a hectare lower yielding than those that haven't, and the same for pests and diseases. The diseases, some of that up until this year is actually split between stem and leaf and root diseases, and actually it looked like there might be something interesting there, but we didn't ask that in that way this year, but maybe we should go back to it because we hadn't really looked at this. So when we had in the cereal yens, we haven't really got a good enough return on this sort of data to make anything on it. But I think the way that we've got it for the beans here is actually quite interesting. That the size of these effects are coming through, and discriminating between the yields that as a community we're achieving.
Thanks, Dan. And of course, I'm sure everybody on this call knows this, but it's always nice to see to have things confirmed in data, and this is of course suggesting that good weed, pest and disease control is important for yields. So harvest losses and reported problems, and this is really interesting, and this is something that we've only done in the bean yens so far. We're actually looking, it's been quite successful, so we're looking to extend this to the pea yen as well, as a learning from the bean yen. And what's really interesting is that when you calculate, you count the number of beans on the ground to give us information on your harvest losses, we are seeing significant associations of this with yield. So if you think about the raw data that you give us back, the average number of beans lost per metre squared that you count has been shown to be negatively associated with yield. So for every bean per metre squared that's counted on the ground for the average crop, that's associated with 0.013 tonne per hectare decrease in yield. And if you take the bottom 25% of yield and the top 25% of yields, and using the 1,000 grain weight from your seed samples, estimate the yield loss on a tonnes per hectare basis, the bottom 25% on yields we're estimating are losing around 0.27 tonnes per hectare, and the top 25% of yields are estimating to lose 0.04 tonnes per hectare. And I think that we had a quick discussion between ourselves and PGR about this, and that amount of yield loss, Roger might correct me, but we think might be associated with perhaps £50, £75 per hectare loss, depending on the kind of final quality, end product quality of the bean crop. So we think this is really important, and how we harvest crops. We don't want to do a really good job of growing these beans all the way through the year and then throw some of it away at the end. But I'm sure that you're all aware of the difficulties that that occur at harvest. Dan, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I'll just add to that. I mean, because to me this is really surprising. We've kind of, when we first sort of talked about doing this, in 2019, I kind of was a bit sceptical that we would actually get anything useful out of it. But it's it's really clear, the effect that we're seeing here. And also there's a large number of, there's a lot of the crops are actually, where the losses equate to more than half a tonne a hectare, and quite a lot, several where the losses are more than a tonne a hectare, that we're measuring from this way. So I think it is important, but what's driving it is a question. Is it just is it a harvest date thing that just those, because I think it seems to be more that it's more due to, the shelling of the beans either before they're going into the header or kind of at that point, but it's rather than kind of poor setup by the combine and being thrown out the back of the combine. But so is it kind of just that some growers are kind of leaving the crops too late and they've already lost some of the yield from shatter before they get to it, or is there something else? I'd be interested in your views on that.
There's a comment in the chat from Martin saying, is there any association with crop height and 1,000 grain weight at home and harvest losses?
And harvest, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a very strong effect of crop height on yield. I've got it open. I'll have a look and see if I can find an association while you speak.
Yeah. So one thing to mention is that Dan actually has the data set open right now. So if you do have any kind of quick questions like that, then we might be able to answer them and get you back an answer as soon as possible. So that's a really good question. Thank you, Martin. And not one thing that we had thought to test, but it does make sense to look at that association. And
there's another question in from Paul, Paul Barnes, who's asking whether any data or growers have used nutrient seed dressing. I suspect that's something that we don't know, but perhaps if there are growers there who have done so, they might be willing to mention that.
I think we do collect that information, but we haven't been putting it back out into the reports. I think Dan's just had a look at the data, and very few crops overall have received one based on the information that we have. But it will be interesting to get people's thoughts on, whether they thought that was a very positive thing to be doing.
And another question, Tom, from Anne Pierce, which might be, is there an association between weed problems and harvest losses? Clearly people latching on to this, which is pleasing.
Yeah, and these are all great questions, and maybe Dan can have a quick look at that as well. And we've been focusing, or we tend to start off focusing in the ends with associations with yield, and we know that that's not always the most important thing. It is important, but we also need to think about quality and questions that we can ask of the data about things on a more practical level, and starting to pull apart aspects of the associations with yield are really interesting. So these are things that when you're looking through the data set, you might not necessarily think that's a good thing to test. So if people have questions or ideas about that, that's really useful, and we'd be very happy to test it, please. So perhaps I should just wait perhaps to see if Dan.
No, well, there's nothing I've found so far with height or harvest date. I was just looking at weeds on the effect of those harvest losses. I can't. Yeah. But well, no, actually, weeds. There's almost a significant impact of weeds, but it goes the wrong direction, so I don't believe it.
I think these questions are all really valid, but I do go back to something that Tom said right at the very beginning. It's separating cause and effect, and we need to, although we can find links, they're not necessarily real links, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean that they're not, and it means there's further things to be explored.
Absolutely. And going back to the the seed dressings, I mean, there's only a very, very small handful of people who have told us, at least, that they've applied any form of seed dressing, and so I haven't, there's not enough to kind of even think about doing an analysis on it. The same with pod sealant. So just seen Steve's put that in there. We did ask. I think it's only maybe the last year we've asked whether people are using pod sealant, but I think there was actually, in the data set at least, there was only 1 or 2 people who said yes. So I mean, if there are people who have used a pod sealant who would like like that, that isn't in the data, then that would be useful to know that, because yeah, we haven't had many people claim it. I don't know. Does the farmers who are on the call, are there many people who have used it, or do routinely use it, or use them?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So I'll just move on to the next slide now, and really enjoying this discussion from people, so thank you very much. And I'm going to pass this slide over to Dan, because this is really hot off the press, and there's some important points to be made again about cause and effect with this, but I think what we're trying to show is that it's an area of research that we're interested in looking at further. So Dan, if you'd like to talk through this slide, please.
Yeah, so one of the strongest associations that I'm seeing is with the bruchid damage. Now, whether that's a direct effect or an indirect effect is sort of something to, or an association, something to kind of discuss, I think. But it does seem to me that there is, there seems to be something there. It's separating out, if you like, the variation in the yields in a way that lots of other things aren't. I have just looked at that in terms of also, as well as kind of the effect on yield, negative effect on yield. It shows up in seeds per metre squared, including pods per shoot, and I'm assuming seeds per pod as well, although I can't get the analysis to one for that, and also as well as seed weight. So it kind of seems to be having an association, at least, with the yield components in a way that you kind of think, well, could make some biological sense in that it's having an impact. But as showed earlier, I mean, there is a kind of a real geographic kind of aspect to it as well. And so if I look at the associations of bruchid beetle damage, then it's highly significantly affected by temperatures in all of summer, and also as well as latitude and longitude. So there's a really big kind of association. There's an association there with temperature and location for bruchid damage, which isn't there for yield. And I think one of the key things to say is that there's no association at all between the bruchid damage and insecticide applications. It's in there. So whether well, I think there's an opportunity here to kind of look at more of whether there are things that what's driving that variation in bruchid damage. I don't know if Becky or anyone wants to say any more to that.
Yeah, I can. We have done quite a lot of work looking at bruchid damage and how that's linked to, well, particularly temperature and location. So we've got a lot of data from across the whole of the UK. So Dan's right, it's significantly associated with temperatures right from April through to July. I'm not surprised to see at all that there's no association at all with insecticide applications. And in terms of its effect on yield, I think there is a direct effect, but I think there's also other indirect effects that lead to a greater yield loss than you might expect from the bruchid damage itself. So I think it definitely warrants more work, and we can have a look at other data sets that we've got already as well, more closely, I think, to see exactly what's going on in terms of number of plants per square metre, number of pods, number of seeds, that type of thing, to see what effect that's having. But yeah, it's quite complicated, I think, but it's not particularly promising that there's no association with insecticide applications, but it does at least allow us to make our decisions based on other things, perhaps. But yeah, very interesting though.
Thanks, Shona. Becky, sorry. Thanks, Becky. So I'll move on now to yield components, and this is where we as physiologists, or at least myself, speaking for myself, as physiologists within ADAS, kind of get most excited about the data. And Dan is going to talk a bit about yield components when he goes through the reports in a session a bit later on. So it might be good to hold some of this in your mind. One thing that I've just realised my camera's not on, sorry. One thing that we've really learned from the bean yen over the past couple of years, and as well in the pea yen, is that for peas and beans particularly, it's really important for us to get actual plant counts. And this is because the way that we calculate plant counts based off grab samples alone is very heavily dependent on kind of how the plants are harvested and how they may be damaged in transit. So we're not actually showing the data from 2019 and 2020 here for plant counts, because that's derived mathematically from yield. But in 2021, I'd like to thank everybody who went out and counted plants or took pictures with an A4 piece of paper, because we are getting actual plant counts now, and the average across winter and spring beans is 44 plants per metre squared in 2021. I haven't separated out the top 25% and bottom 25% of yields for spring and winter beans here, because once you take into account the lower number of winter beans, we're dealing with low numbers overall for those averages. One thing to note though is that even if we do look at the derived data, so that mathematically calculated data of plant counts from yields and grab samples, we don't see a positive association of plant counts and yield. We don't see a positive association between shoots per plant and yield. And you can see that in the winter bean data set, we see more shoots per plant than in the spring bean data set, which is what we might expect. Shoots per metre squared. So take this with a bit of a pinch of salt, because this for 2019 to 2020 is based on that derived data. But again, when you factor in the number of shoots per plant with the plant counts, we don't see a positive association with yield. What we do see positive associations with is the number of pods per shoot, the number of seeds per pod, and the number of seeds per metre squared in the crop at harvest, and also 1,000 seed weight. So for the average crop, for pods per shoot, for every extra pod per shoot, that's associated with a 0.8 tonnes per hectare increase in yield. For seeds per pod, in the average crop, an extra seed per pod is associated with 0.94 tonnes per yield, above the average amount. And you see that the average amount for spring beans is around 2.6, 2.9, and winter beans 2.9 and 3. Seeds per metre squared, for every seed per metre squared extra in the crop at harvest, for an average crop, that's associated with 0.05 tonnes per hectare. And seed weight, for every increase in 1,000 seed in individual seed weight per milligram in the average crop, that's associated with 0.007 tonnes per hectare in yield. So we see a lot of positive associations with these different yield components with yield overall. Somebody asked some questions about plant height and is interested to think about plant height with harvest losses. When you look at plant height across winter and spring varieties and apply the REML analysis to it, we see a positive association overall with plant height and yield. So for every centimetre increase above the average, that's associated with 0.02 tonnes per hectare in our data set. And we also see positive associations with the total dry matter per plant, the total dry matter per shoot, the bean dry matter per plant, and biomass overall. And this is suggesting to us that rather than the number of plants being maximised for these bean crops, we're seeing positive associations of larger individual plants with more pods per shoot, and this might be because the plants are taller and have space for those more pods per shoot, and within that they have more bean dry matter per plant, more seeds per metre squared, and within those pods there's more seeds per pod. And we also see a positive association with harvest index, so the proportion of seed in those high yielding crops is associated with higher yields. And we'll come back and summarise this and put it all together in some following slides. But I'll just have a quick so if nobody has any questions about these different yield components, we'll talk a bit more about yield components in Dan's session, then I'll move on to summarising the analysis that we've seen so far. So as Roger rightly said, we have to think about these in terms of associations, and we've looked at all these factors individually, and for any crop it's almost explicitly likely that there's lots of different factors that will be impacting overall yield, and there's a job for us to do when we look at our reports to think about which factors are most important for yield. And we have to bear in mind that these are associations, so we've talked about associations of bruchid beetle damage with yield, but also bruchid beetle damage with summer temperatures. So we have to be careful where there's associations that are similar, because it's hard to say what is more important in those instances. But if we look at the data we have so far, we don't see any associations with yield and location overall, and yields weren't limited by the yield potentials that we calculated. So that suggests that good yields are available or are possible across the UK. We do see that heavier soils tended to see lower yields, and we saw that lower index P soils were associated with low yields as well. Potassium inputs were positively associated with yield, and this was reflected in the seed analysis, and we also saw some associations with micronutrients supplied. When we think about crop development and agronomy, higher yields may have been associated with earlier sowing, late harvest and longer season length. We have to think about how winter and spring varieties were planted in a given season though when we think about that. Higher yields were associated with good pest and weed disease control, or that's our take-home point based on the analysis that Dan's talked about, as we saw significant REML associations with fungicide use and insecticide use, but also with the amount of pest and disease problems recorded. We did see associations with bruchid beetle damage, but the data shows it's not controlled by insecticide use and it's related to summer temperatures. And we can see from the data that it's very likely that minimising harvest losses is important. And many crops lost over half a tonne per hectare, we estimate, and several, this might have been over a tonne per hectare in harvest losses. So when we think about yield components, higher yields were positively associated with pods per shoot and seeds per pod, but not shoots per metre squared. And we saw associations of yield with bean size, or the 1,000 seed weight that was measured, and also plant height, individual plant and shoot biomass, crop biomass, and harvest index were all associated with high yields. And this is suggesting to us that higher yields come from large, well-podded plants with several seeds per pod. And if you think about, how these yield components are affected by factors when we look through the scientific literature, this points towards maximising light capture and avoiding stress through flowering to increase the sink size. And seed filling is important for seed size, and this is potentially linked to avoiding stress during seed fill and maximising the duration of the canopy during seed fill. So we're not going to talk about what contributes high yields just yet. We're going to circle back into Dan's presentation, and on the benchmarking reports. But before we do that, I'd just like to give an opportunity for people to give any comments or questions on the slides that we've just discussed.
Tom, there's been quite a few questions asked and answered in the chat. There's one question here from Steve Portas which says, is there any data on pod sealants? I don't know if any of that data has been collected through the YEN. What I can say is that a few years ago we had a commercial trial on pod sealant, and obviously can't tell you exactly what it was. There was a difference in that the treated spring beans yielded more seeds, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Roger. Dan might have been about to say this, but we have collected pod sealant data in the last year, but we've had very low use overall, I think, so it's hard to say what effects it might be having yet.
I mean, sort of, to me, this is the kind of question which is, there's a whole load of stuff that we could be doing here in the future. Maybe kind of, even talking to the combine, the class, the combine manufacturers, kind of who, whether it's an issue of harvest date or kind of, or there's anything we can do about setting up the combine, or whether using a header with a longer table that helps pick up some of those beans that are shattering, those kind of things. Whether any of that is kind of part of the difference that we're seeing. How is it that the highest yielding people who are achieving the highest yields are also achieving the lowest losses, if you like?
Yeah. And there's also there was also some questions about for biostimulants and nutrients on the seed, and Becky has promised to send out a link. I'm not sure how we'll do that, maybe by email or WhatsApp once the report is on our website, but there is also some of that available in the Pulse magazine, which has just it's just been printed. It should be on its way to you via CPM and is available on the PGRO website.
So, Becky, can you send that to me as well, please? Because we're doing a review on biostimulants on DEFRA. Well, I'm not, but colleagues are. So, that would be useful. I don't know if you've been to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's no problem. There are one or two products that overall over the 3 years for all the crops, because we looked at vining peas, combining peas, and spring beans that do sort of overall stand out in terms of yield, and they're not always the ones you might expect. There's quite a lot of variability, of course, across the years, but when you look at the sort of combined data, it's promising. And so I won't name them right now, but I'll send the report. Will be published very soon, and I'll send it to them.
Tom, you've put up now a discussion on what contributes to higher yields, but are we circling back to Dan's presentation first? Yeah. And Dan, can I suggest you start from the beginning again, because we kind of only got to about slide 3, I think, and it all went pear-shaped.
Yeah, which way are you going, Tom?
I'm going back now. Yeah, thank you everybody for bearing with that diversion, and hopefully Dan now will be able to kind of put some of the data that we've discussed into a bit of context in terms of the report. So Dan, I'll click through the slides if you like. So
yeah, go on then.
Just let me know.
Yeah, so if you go through, so I mean, like I say, this is kind of, well, what Tom has been showing you is kind of the whole data set across all 3 years, kind of looking at what's driving yield. But obviously in each year we've kind of been talking about each individual, the data, and what's in your reports is the data from that individual year and how you compare and that. And so I don't know. Well, I don't know if we want to have a discussion really about whether the extent to which where yields were this year, to kind of whether people have thoughts on what's really what's driven yields this year, if you like. But we can start to get at that now with the kind of data that we're collecting in a way that we haven't been able to before, in terms of looking at differences in yield components and grain size and these kind of things. But you know, we're middling this year anyway, so I'm not sure there's a kind of huge story there. But happy to discuss that if anyone has got ideas or thoughts, or whether they think they've had, you know, there's been a very large variation in yields again this year, hasn't there? You know, with the challenges that the weather threw at us. Go to the next one. So yeah, so your reports. So I mean, I just wanted to we'll just go through them essentially, and whether in terms of and then kind of think about how best for you to get stuff out of them in terms of interpreting them, if you like. So if you go to the next thing, so the first thing is kind of what you have achieved. And so this is an example report. It's actually an example report from quite a high yielding crop, a crop that did 7 tonnes a hectare. But we set out by trying to understand the yields and the context in terms of the resources, that's available to you, and those resources really being light and water. So that's what we and we set that out on the page, how we then turn that statement of resources, if you like, into this potential yield. And so the potential yield that we kind of say, given, which is basically just a very simple and crude calculation of just of applying what we kind of think is possible. What's the maximum possible canopy size? Now, how big could your crop conceivably be through the season, and how long is it feasible to keep that crop alive, through the summer, so that you can still harvest it? Well, ideally before the end of September. But obviously, this is with beans. We have a really wide variation here between, what's even doable now in, from between the south of England and, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There's, we're where lots of crops are already kind of into October before they're being harvested. So yeah, but that simple statement of what's shown up in these curves is of what's feasible, and then in terms of light interception. And applying that to the light available gives us the kind of absolute total amount of light that we can intercept. We use a kind of an estimate or an assumption of how efficiently, what's the maximum efficiency that we could convert that light into dry matter, and importantly for beans, taking into account the fact that we are also fixing nitrogen. And so you have to get that nitrogen, you're having to feed the bugs with a bit of carbon to do that. So that essentially reduces your radiation use efficiency, because you're having to pay the bugs. And so that then being the that sets a total, and then but you have to also have water available. If you haven't got the water available to satisfy that demand for the dry matter that you're creating, the carbohydrate that you're creating, the protein and the assimilate that you're creating, then the growth will stop. So obviously the amount of water that you have, and we assume, and that depends both on how much rain you have during the summer, and also how well your crop explores the soil. So really, soil depth is really important to that, and we're assuming for beans that we can root to 1 meters deep. But if you're on shallow soils, then you won't get as much. And if you're on a sandier soil, will hold less water than a silty or a clayey soil. So that's really what drives that, and that's what kind of goes into that calculation. So then we present back to you the weather, and so being able to see this in the context of how your weather compares to other people in the year, and in terms of that whole data set it will be worth thinking about. You go to the next one, Tom. So then we use these benchmarking diagrams, which hopefully you're now kind of familiar with, to kind of set out where you sit in relation to the rest of the data set for that year, within that year, for all these parameters that may or may not be important in terms of achieving high yields. And so with the central line in the middle here being the average of everyone in the end, and all the grey box essentially representing 50% of all of the data in the yen, and then the extremes of the whiskers plot there being the range in the data, and then your entry being the orange bar is in there. So we start with an analysis of the soil and going through that, and so and again, from a large part of that is from the way that we think about that is kind of how that affects how much water is going to be available. So you know the amount of clay, the amount of silt, soil organic matter, but then also from a nutrient perspective in terms of soil pH and soil pH, etc. Now we've got the rhizobia measurements in there that Tom mentioned. So you go to the next slide. And then going through the agronomy, and in terms of the kind of the sowing date and the number of applications that you're saying, so we're reporting all that data back to you, so you can see how you sit compared to everybody else in the data set from there. To the next, Tom. And then we go through the crop development phases, like Tom said about, and this is where we kind of see this as being important in terms of actually those phases of growth, matching those phases of growth up to the weather, and being able to then identify where there might have been a problem, where maybe we could have done better. So the next one, Tom. Then we've got the nutrient capture from the tissue analysis again, so you can see how you sit from those two leaf tissue sampling measurements that were made during the season. So again, Tom. And then getting into the water capture and actually how much of the water that you actually you've had available to you compared to everybody else, and how well you're capturing that. And again, Tom. And the same then for energy, and then going through the yield formation, the yield components, and the way that we think about yield in terms of biomass and harvest index. Again, so sort of seeing how you fit. So you can see with this crop that it was a high yielding crop that had a high biomass with a very high harvest index, but actually a very low, or quite a yield potential on the low side. So they achieved that despite having not an awful lot of light available. Next, Tom. And again, continuing that with the yield components, and then through into thinking about the seed, the protein and the bruchid damage which we've got here, and then on to next one, Tom. The nutrients in the seed, and this is what we've been doing in the yens now, kind of that being able to take this, well, the nutrition, the grain nutrients in the seed being kind of an indicator of how much of these nutrients are actually available to you, to the crop, through the season, and thinking about that not just from what might have been applied, but what's available from the soil and how well your crop was able to access what was in the soil. And so this is where it's interesting that we've got this association coming through with, or just about coming through with potassium in there now. Yeah. Okay, so go through that. So that was kind of just an individual report, and so what Roger has done here, we work with Roger Bradley, who's one of really the architect of these reports, is kind of put together a bit of a process, if you like, for how we kind of think of getting the most out of these reports. And so starting with that headline performance of how you compared to the potential, and how you're comparing to other people in the group. And thinking about this season and the potential in this season and how the weather might have affected that, and how anything this year might be different to the long-term average. And thinking about it from the soil texture and fertility and health, and is there more that we can do there? Have you got enough organic matter? Is it releasing the nutrients? Is it making water available? Is there anything we can do in terms of exploiting more of the soil for getting better rooting from subsoiling or whatever? Thinking about variety choice and agronomy, and so the important thing about varieties is that they're pretty much the variety and sowing date are the only things that are going to affect crop development, which is the next thing coming up there. But from an agronomy perspective, thinking about that in terms of how's what you're doing compared to what other people are doing? Are there things that maybe could have done better, or maybe things that we could have saved on? And then coming to crop development and thinking about those phases of growth compared to others and compared to what we think is normal. I think this is where we haven't, as an industry, we often talk about it being an early season or a late season, but we don't really have data sets. We don't really ever collect that in a objective way to very easily be able to compare between people or between seasons. But having a colder period can be beneficial in the sense that you then have a longer period for that development phase to intercept more resources, especially when you're kind of forming seeds. So that point which you're forming pods or setting pods or setting seeds for pod. If you've got cold temperatures and lots of light during that period, then that's going to be beneficial to setting that sink essentially. And thinking about resource capture and how basically how we can keep the crop alive for as long as possible, keeping the canopies alive, keeping through whether that's fungicide use or kind of protecting it from disease, which we're sort of starting to see, or whether accessing water. How can we get those roots down deep? And actually that might come back down to establishment. Getting good establishment at the start might be the key thing that we can do to minimise compaction and set the crop up for getting roots that can go down. But thinking about that in terms of was that something that was limiting to me or not? The access of water. Then thinking about that nutrient analysis to kind of see actually where my spring nutrient level's okay, or where things are limited there, and then getting to the yield and those yield components. Each of those components is telling us something different about. It's telling us about when any limitation occurred, because obviously we're forming first of all the number of plants, the number of shoots, then the number of pods per shoots and the number of seeds per pod, and then finally the seed size and weight. Well, seed size is almost set before seed weight, and so that kind of the yield components tell us about when any kind of limitations were actually being incurred through the season here. And then thinking about that from from the seed size perspective, of then actually kind of that telling us about how well we've managed to keep that crop alive and get through seed filling, and holding all the assimilates that are becoming available. And then finally with the grain, the grain analysis, the post-mortem analysis of that in terms of what nutrients may or may not have been limiting to us, and that kind of then going back into the following year. And it's really a repetitive process in terms of thinking about this, for what's affecting the crops on my farm in my individual context. And we have farmers from the cereal Jens who kind of say about this report being the best thing they have, but they really do, to get the most out of it, you really do have to invest in it. He says that he kind of he reads it a dozen times a year. We're not expecting you all to do that, but hopefully there's something in there where you can get some value out of it to think about what maybe you could do differently, or where there may be a limitation and what possibly we might be able to do about it. Okay. So thanks. So do you want to go next, Tom? So is there any kind of questions on the reports whilst we're there, or kind of anything that anyone's uncertain about, or anything that's come out of any of your individual reports that you kind of has made you think, or you'd question?
So Dan, you're not getting swamped with questions.
Well, I think we've kind of discussed quite a lot of this before, haven't we? Because with Tom, kind of we've gone through a lot of it.
Yeah. Well, maybe if largely that, I think presentations are perhaps over. Are they? Is your last session got any slides, Daniel, or not?
Well, only just in terms of the future developments.
Yeah.
Where we go next, but kind of, yeah, if people want to discuss any more about, like you said, you know, what.
Well, I just wonder if we could try something, perhaps to spark a little discussion. If there isn't any, that's fine. But perhaps we could all turn our cameras on, turn the presentation off, and then we can see who's actually out there listening to what's been going on, and maybe share some thoughts with one another. I know that I see one's popped up in the chat. And maybe this one's for you, Daniel, is how many years data is required before adding the critical and benchmark lines to the chart?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a little complicated by not having the the separation, the winter and spring crops being different, but actually also being, you know, quite a lot of overlap between them. So because you can obviously sow a spring variety in the winter, and you can sow a winter variety in the spring, and kind of that distinction kind of, I think, you know, has a impact. And we always think about, so for those kind of benchmarks, I think often there isn't necessarily a critical threshold. I think for the nutrients, I mean, I think originally we did have them, and kind of it's I'm nervous a little bit about kind of saying that there's a book value that if you're below this, then, you know, you've got a problem. But because you only really know that if we've done experiments and shown that by being in that situation and having applied something, or something that we could have done about it, we could have there's a penalty that we could have addressed by doing something differently.
Do you think it's fair to say that as the data set builds, and this is the importance for getting more and more data point entries, as the data set builds, trends are going to become more significant, and that we can infer more from trends with a larger data set than we can with a small data set.
Yeah, and I think one of the limitations in a way with the report as it is at the moment is that because it's a season specific, isn't it? And you haven't, so there isn't learning in the report at the moment of what we've learned over the whole 3 seasons. So I think we can, going forward, think about for the whole range of those things actually. But what's the average, or what's the point, or maybe you know, what's the 25% maximum or minimum for any one of those metrics that we've seen over the 3 years would be a useful kind of reference point in those charts, because like I said, we don't really have them in the beginning at the moment.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, I can see Dan's nervousness to call something a critical value without doing kind of extra experiments. But what we have done, especially with the advent of yen nutrition and some of the yens that have been going on a bit longer, so have more samples so far. For nutrients, we've been able to apply what we've termed as yen high and low values. So I think if we call things, if we better kind of communicate that these are things that are associated within the yen data set by calling them yen high and low values, I think we'd be more comfortable to add those as lines on the charts that hopefully give a bit more context to people year on year. So hopefully, if next year even if we don't have lots of critical values to put on, we can add in, as Dan says, high and low values based on kind of averages across the data set, and hopefully that will kind of help us to show that, you know, these are associations, but perhaps not kind of experimentally tested, but it's still useful for people to be able to see averages that come from many years of data, I think.
Thanks, Tom. If we can move on, perhaps there's another question here, cheeky question from Anne Pierce, who's just popped up on the screen as well. And Anna, if bigger, bolder, better plants are better, is there any benefit from applying nitrogen? Well, we're not allowed to do that, so it's more or less a moot point. But yeah, it's been a question that's been asked loads and loads of times. I don't know if anybody's got any comments on it.
I think there's some work done with the Saskatchewan pea growers. Not sure if it was just peas or beans, and increasing rates of nitrogen led to decreasing colonisation of rhizobia, to the extent that I think it was 50 kilos of N, you've got little or no rhizobia associations.
Yeah, this is quite well known, Steve, and is mentioned on numerous occasions. The addition of nitrogen basically inhibits the plant from forming its own associations and nitrogen fixing, which then gives you a crop that's also dependent upon artificial nitrogen, which removes all the environmental benefits that might be associated with it, or a lot of them, sorry, not all of them. So it might be tempting, Anna, but I don't think we're going to start advocating that soon.
And I'm not sure how much it would really help, you know, because if it's about us establishing a good, healthy plant, you know, it's about that establishment, really, isn't it? And it's sort of, you know, if it's got wet feet and kind of compacted soil and kind of, you know, the rest of it, how much is, you know, putting a bit of nitrogen on really going to help? And really, we want to be avoiding that situation. We want to be putting them in the right conditions. I think that's the.
Okay, I mean, I'm organic, so don't put on any nitrogen anyway, but the nitrogen in my actual bean sample at the end is very low. So you're saying that perhaps putting muck on before I drill them?
But you shouldn't, but the nitrogen and the protein, you know, we obviously, for beans, we obviously need to be thinking about nitrogen in this context completely differently to any of the other nutrients, because it's being made by the plant, essentially. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a question, and there aren't kind of associations that I'm seeing with that at the moment. But kind of the extent to which protein per se is, you know, indicative of the health of the plant, you know, I think is a kind of an interesting kind of question, especially from that kind of organic perspective. But it's not something that we should be worried about, and it's not something that, yeah, in an organic, well, whether it does say anything about, you know, the colonisation, the rhizobia or whatever, you know, and how well N fixing is happening, I'm not sure. Maybe we'll start to get that over time a little bit. We can look at things like total nitrogen uptake. I think we are measuring the nitrogen in the straw this year, Tom.
Yeah, we've got the samples, and we've actually got the samples from 2020 that we want to send away as well. So hopefully get a bit more information on that. I mean, if not nitrogen applied directly, kind of, can you extend the question to kind of rhizobium inoculation applications? Kind of how much do we know about that in the UK? Because I know that it is done for other pulse crops in other countries, but I was wondering if we have a lot of research within the UK on the effects of that.
There's quite a lot of research being done on that, and particularly up at the James Sutton Institute. And we also know that there is a relationship between nodulation and phosphate levels as well. So there's no silver bullet to all of this. It's very much an ecosystem that's in a fine balance. And just in this conversation, I'm thinking, yes, maybe you do end up with a nitrogen shortage if you've got a phosphate shortage and your rhizobia levels are really low, and you aren't getting effective nodulation. So it could be, you know, you could be attacking this from many different angles, and I'm pretty certain that what we're doing here with the yen is starting to tease out some of those things, and as we get more data, we'll be able to make more inferences from it. And yeah, see Lee has put, does nitrogen coming from organic manures or high organic matter soils have the same effect of inhibiting rhizobia? It's a question.
And yeah, and there were some significant effects coming through from manures and kind of manure type, and which didn't kind of make an awful lot of intuitive sense. And so I'm not 100% convinced by them, but there's something there. There is some separation between the farms who are doing some things and other things that, in terms of the yields that are being achieved, essentially. But so I think there is something to look at there.
But then it comes down to
bean crops. Bean crops have got it costs them energy to host rhizobia. If they don't have to host the rhizobia because there's excess nitrogen about, then why would they do it? It's this sounds like they're thinking about it, which of course they're not. But it's all balanced together. So maybe, Lee, if you've got excessively high nitrogen levels in an organic soil, perhaps there is a possibility that that the beans aren't nodulating as they would do, but then we don't know quite what levels of nitrogen you're talking about at the time that you might be sowing the crop. So yeah,
I suppose just the questions coming from quite a few people over with us. Springtime's a good time of year to apply organic, farmyard manure and the likes of that. And that's a question we get quite often, should that go on for a bean crop? But just what you were saying there about the artificial nitrogen, that's sort of what led me to ask that question.
I've just found actually a significant association of soil phosphorus on grain nitrogen concentration, which kind of implies that. So soil in the low soil, so soil pH index 0 and 1 have got a lower grain nitrogen concentration as well as a lower yield. So maybe that, like you said, Roger, there is an impact there of that low phosphorus content affecting nodulation, and that's part of the mechanism there.
Yeah. Paul, can you ask your question directly? Paul Barnes, you put one in the chat about grass, but I'm not sure I quite understand the question properly. So you might be better to ask it directly.
Yeah, okay. It was just on another webinar meeting, I think it was, where people are coming out of temporary grass, and there was one comment where spring beans, because obviously the potential of cutworm, wireworm into a arable, let's say, cereal crop, they're seeing better returns on putting beans after temporary grass. And again, it's just if anybody else has seen that or used it. And with the increased areas of AB15 and countryside stewardship, and again, it's just a question to the table on people's experiences and thoughts.
Steve, you're looking like you wanted to speak. Steve,
well, I was just thinking, it's all about soil structure as well, isn't it? And of a grower who uses haylage in a rotation and grows spring beans in another part of the rotation, and the soil structure is so good after temporary grass, isn't it? That it's it's depth of rooting, it's soil structure, it's more worms, it's all those, and sort of maybe a bit of min-till, it's all those sorts of benefits to allow the beans to extract more water from a bigger root system.
Yeah, I think it's that, and it's just not moving the soil as well, Steve. Those that are in conventional systems simply spray off with glyphosate, direct drill the beans in, and it's very, very simple. So again, it's just it's just one that sort of cropped up in recent months on putting beans into the system. And again, we've got a wide variety of people on the webinar today, so it's just trying to bounce ideas, practices, experiences going forward, because isn't that what it's all about? I'm probably certainly going to have a look at it where I've got a living mulch in the system, but again, just listening to Anna's point and everybody else's point about nitrogen, where I've got a living mulch trial, the white clover is going to produce obviously N from there. Is it going to have an effect or a negative effect, shall we say, on the beans if I direct drill the beans into that living mulch? So again, so many questions, not only from the conventional side, but also from us who are practicing organic standards.
I mean, there was a useful example. One of my growers some years ago who was using sewage cake quite early on, and he acted as a contractor on an adjacent farm where sewage cake was not being used, and were both. He was growing beans on both sides. Newcastle University did a study and saw a big increase in worms where the sewage cake had been used. So not using sewage cake just prior to planting the beans, but a year or two back in rotation and over a few years. So soil health was greatly improved, and the yields were higher where the sewage cake had been used. There seemed to be plenty of rhizobia, so it's all those organic applications that was working.
I think it's probably worth noting that we regularly try to promote beans through PGRO as being a good entry for other crops and improving the soil conditions for other crops. But they do in themselves benefit from going into good soil conditions. So it's a full rotation, as we know, and we should be looking after all crops in there. Lee, another question in relation to cover crops before beans. And does anybody have a particular recommendation if they're using one? Are they willing to share that with everybody else if it's a huge success? No, nobody's prepared to share their knowledge on that one. Lee, I know that there's a wide and varied number of cover crops being used out there, and one that I've been particularly taken with, I've heard him talk about it several times, Peter Cartwright at Revesby Estates, who uses winter sown oats, and he uses them as essentially as a weed suppressant, killing off the oats but leaving them in situ just after the beans have been drilled. So that he has huge success with that. So I wouldn't hesitate offering that as an option for people.
I agree. Roger, could I just say, that's another question that I've come to on this dual cropping or multi-cropping that I'm looking at.
Yeah.
And again, putting spring oats to and again into the organic system, weed suppression, PGRO, obviously looking at results of bits and bobs on sowing rates, drilling rates, going through for the mixed species. So again, that's something personally on my radar. And again, if there's anything from the team or on the call today who've had experiences that, by all means, reach out and let's have a chat and see where we can all go forward.
Thanks for that, Paul. We're sure to want to keep in touch with you on that one. Anna, another one from Anna Pierce. Do you analyse nodulation levels during the season? Project by project, we do at PGRO. I don't know if others are doing that within their own activities. Perhaps somebody else would like to comment.
Would it be worth including it in the yen, as in we dig up a few plants during the season and either take a picture or count?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. It's a good point, and it's something that we considered for the P yen, and of a long-standing and very well-informed agronomist, Keith Costello, who I think might have joined this meeting as well. We started to put some protocols together, but it was just thinking of a way that we can do it in a standardized way, because it's kind of like a count. Sometimes it's difficult to make sure that everybody's doing it in the same way so we can apply data analysis to it. So we thought about various different things like taking photos of the nodules after they've been washed, so that we could do the counts ourselves to help standardize things, but we never really got to the bottom of the best way to do it. But it's something that we definitely have considered in the past and would be useful. It's just thinking about the most practical way to do it, I think.
I would advocate just doing, if we could get to just a none sum lots, just simple as that. But it's kind of how we get you guys to kind of differentiate between sum and lots, I guess, is part of the issue. But it's I think it would be really useful to have something.
Yeah, I was just going to say roughly the same thing. I'm wondering if it might be, I don't know what you think, but one way of doing it would be maybe to have like an image that we provide with the pack that you can just sort of compare your nodulation against a key almost, I suppose. That might be one way of doing it.
Good point.
Okay.
When would you?
Comment, sorry, I'm moving on. A comment.
We might have lost Roger.
Which I think, Dan, you can then ask the question you were going to ask.
I was going to just ask when would be the right time to assess nodulation? We lost Becky as well.
Maybe we've lost all PGRO, which would be a tragedy.
As it would.
Pre-flower, is that the best time?
Can I come in, if that's right?
Yeah,
Tom?
yes, of course, Keith.
Yeah, basically, I mean, once you get to growth stage 34, you'll find we're just starting nodulation. So, and the plants and the root systems is quite easy to dig up, and normally the ground is allows you to do that because it's still soft and you can actually see the nodules. As we go through the period, though, land gets dry, and what we found with the pea crop and the very fine root systems, it's very difficult to actually dig the root system up without, breaking off or losing a lot of the nodules in there. So that was the practical side of it. If we could resolve that, then it'd be great, because the one thing I've noticed is that back in the 70s and 80s, we would see very fibrous root systems with, lots of nodules. And what I have been seeing more and more is that we've had less nodulation and just sort of less, the root system haven't been quite as fibrous. So it'd be good to actually be able to measure it, but it's just finding a practical time. Ideally, it wants to be done probably prior to flowering. That would be a good time, because by then, if we've had weevil activity, which we know the larvae will start to, eat the nodules, you can see what sort of the situation is, whether you've still got active nodules at that time. And I think, to me, that would be a good time to be able to do it if we could do it in a practical way.
I mean, so to me, there's a practical question. Do you say do it at this growth stage, or should we just say the second week of April or whatever, or in this period is the time to do it? And so you kind of then get that, it's more defined by a date rather than the growth stage.
I mean, April might be a little bit too soon, Daniel, because of the size of the plants then, but maybe into May, beginning of May would be a timing then.
Keith, do you see more nodulation in soils with higher organic matters?
Yes, and what I will say, I'm really pleased to see now in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I'm definitely seeing improvements in soil structures on the farms. I'm certainly seeing better root systems, and I'm seeing more fibrous, certainly where we've got more organic in the soil. So, I mean, that's a great sign. I'm fairly optimistic that we're now starting to turn corners. And the more we can get data now on fields like we're doing through the pea and the bean yen, and sharing that, I mean, I think we can actually start to pick up the trends, and the data is starting to prove things we believe in, but the data is now confirming that, and that's great to see. So hopefully we get more growers on board now in both of the ends, and we can start to get more data coming in, which is going to benefit everyone. But I'm pleased to say that I am seeing improvements in the in root systems. I'm seeing improvements in nodulation, and I think also many have now realised that it's so important to get the establishment. It's attention to detail with these specialist crops, and I think that's where we're going to start to see the better yields coming in. But I'm optimistic of the future now. I think we're starting to, but I hope more and more people will join the ends.
Thanks, Keith. Really useful, thank you. I've just seen, I mean, this is, I'm picking on this because I think it's something that I'd be interested in understanding more about. Somebody asked about going back to harvest losses and whether we should measure the height of the lowest pod. And we've discussed this before, but it's tricky with our graph samples because where they're caught out of the crop and how they travel in the bag. Sometimes the pods fall off, or we don't know the exact height of the lowest pod. So I just wanted to ask a general question to growers within the bean yen, whether, because we want to make sure we're not asking for too many assessments and too many field visits because it comes a lot, but whether measuring the height of the lowest pod, say at senescence or harvest, and then giving us that information back would be something that's practical to do, because I think that might be a good piece of data to add in. Another thing is that I think we're seeing that the duration of seed filling is very important. So knowing the date of senescence is also quite useful. We do ask for this information, and some people, quite a lot of people have given us that information back, but whether we could do a lowest pod height measurement at senescence, we could then make that one field visit, date of senescence and height of the lowest pod.
Maybe a show of hands if you'd be willing to do it.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't really, I didn't really kind of suggest how we might. Well,
if we could use if you look on your app, so you can put your hand, raise your hand with the Control Shift plus K, we can count the number.
Or you can use a heart.
Or a heart, yeah, very
Dan's
cute.
got a heart. Oh yes, so that looked very. Thank you, Charlotte, because I didn't really consider how I would get the responses from that question, but that's really useful because what we don't want to do is add in extra things to what we already know is a busy schedule of assessments and information. We're looking to refine our information we ask, so we want to be careful about what we add in as well. So that's useful. Thank you.
So, Tom, sorry, I had a malfunction here and was squeezed out of the Teams platform for a bit. I think two or three others of us may have also experienced the same. But congratulations for that last question, because you've elicited some responses from those hiding behind the camera off button, which is great. It's nice to know that everyone's really taking this in. I'm conscious that we're about 10 minutes from closure time, and Daniel, you've still got something to add, I think, for improvements for next year. So if you need those 10 minutes, we'd better cut the discussion now and go into that, unless you want to just keep this going and abbreviate your improvement content.
Well, I mean, to be honest, part of it is what we're discussing there about that kind of thing of, are we getting this about right in terms of, I mean, there is some improvements that we can talk about in terms of what we're looking to do in terms of moving things more online. We've got a new project we're calling Farm Pep that kind of gives us some opportunities to develop some of the systems here, and including things like, well, hopefully, ideally, satellite imagery. And so where, you know, that kind of thing, a question about senescence, you know, it's not going to happen soon, but we could ultimately, within a couple of years, be in a position where we can just get, you know, satellite data from your crops, and actually these kind of tracking those points at which the growth, you know, starts, when you've reached the kind of the full size of a canopy, getting some estimate of what the size of your, you know, what your leaf area index is essentially. Then when senescence starts, when senescence finishes, you know, even kind of when you've harvested the crop, is all stuff that is, if it isn't completely cloudy the whole time, you can get some indication on a little, yeah, on a which takes some of the onerousness away, and kind of we can use that at scale.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands up, one from Paul and one from Lee. Whether these are contributions to improvements. Paul, perhaps I think your hand went up first, maybe.
It was just to comment on what Daniel just said. I use a simple app for NDVI mapping. Also, a good friend and neighbour, he's doing some trials with his drone work to pick up an image nitrogen. So obviously he can plug his imagery from his drone into his liquid sprayer, for that, and it's whether that imagery or that technology is going to help this forum going forward. So again, it's things are happening out there, and I get it, Daniel, what we can do, and the technology is there to help us. It's just how we embrace it. You know, we've seen it, and I've seen it myself this year on the yield mapping from the combine. It's there, and it's using that data and going forward. So yeah, it's a space to watch, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and this, especially with the, I mean, one of the things that we want to be able to do going forwards as well is, you know, is be able to, you know, have a community where we can experiment, and that's one to us is one of the key things that yield mapping and satellite imaging and all that allows, and drones and whatever else, is just kind of doing something different and seeing what the impact is, whether that's a biostimulant or the, you know, the way or the drilling technique, or, you know, whatever, you know, or even, you know, using pod stick, you know, it's kind of that kind of a question. We can do that in a way, and that's we need to work out how to fund it as funders, because obviously because really the facilitation of that and doing that in a way in which actually we can learn together and kind of be supported and get to results which have some robustness, if you like, because rather than because the underlying spatial variation is always so great in these, it's very dangerous just to take this figure versus that figure and just believe it. But we've got the approaches to do that. So one of the things we want to do is put those tools in your hand.
Just on that drone, from what my friend is looking at doing, he's trying to run it through a FIPL grant, which is Farming in Protective Landscape, up here on the Wolds. So something that could or is potentially be a commercial base where it goes out to other fields, Daniel. So again, keep you posted, you know, and it's something he can potentially get the grant because he's sharing that technology and he's sharing that information and guidance to other people. So again, cost wise, we don't know yet, but again, it's something that they are looking at probably setting up as a business, you know, taking on a full-time drone pilot to go and do this across the country. So again, it's happening, but just very, very slowly at the moment until they get technology sorted.
I mean, there's something really exciting which is happening, which should hope, fingers crossed, happen this year. You know, with DEFRA funding, and DEFRA kind of supporting essentially applied R&D, but also supporting farmers getting involved in innovation, essentially. And I think the group that we have here of a community of people who are interested in furthering the bean crop, if you like, is a ready-made kind of network that should be fundable with this new kind of DEFRA funding. So that should be coming out in kind of June this year, but we could be thinking about putting something really neat into that kind of would allow us to kind of do what we're doing, supporting what we're doing with a bit of supercharging, but also get to that kind of, for the people who want to, people who are interested in kind of doing a bit of experimentation and going to and testing things, kind of supporting that as well.
Thanks, Dan. Lee, you had your hand up, you've withdrawn it. If you've got something to say, now's the chance. No, shaking his head, I think. No, shaking his head. So is there anybody else on the call who's got any thoughts or suggestions about improvements in the yen that they'd like to see for 2022 season ahead? If you have got them but are too shy to put them forward right now, please feel free to email either the yen email, anyone on the yen team, or myself, or anyone at PGRO, and we'll make sure that those are collated and put into consideration, because now is the time when we're sort of furiously planning for the season, which isn't really that far away. In fact, if you're a winter bean grower, it's already there, isn't it? So please make sure you get your views forwards.
Registration is open now.
Yes, indeed, Deval, registration is open.
But I don't know if Deval wants to add anything in terms of improvements to processes that you're keen to talk about.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. We have heard and learned that multiple yen entrants, so the entrant who is entering into multiple yens, found a bit challenging to enter the data between different form links. So we are now coming ahead with a single page sheet where you can tick off and manage the process very well. This document should be available to everyone from January if you're registering, and if not, and if you're registering any earlier, we will email you this particular document. We hope using this you should be able to manage all the processes which we request you all around the year to be managed and have a proper log of it. But apart from this, if there is anything else you want us to improve, then please let us know, and we will try our best to put it into action as soon as possible.
Okay. Well, I don't see. Oh, Paul. Yeah, Paul. Okay, is an idea, a Bean Yen app. We'd have to give some thought as to how and what that constituted, I guess, and perhaps that's something we can bring into our discussions. Yeah, if anyone's got any thoughts, what they would like to see on that app or the purpose of that app, if they've got any particular feedback, please send it in to us.
Roger, can I add something?
You may.
Yeah, thanks. Just also want to add that this could be the last year when you are asked to fill different form links, because we are hoping to integrate the system in a way that you have a single user ID password and you log into your system and enter data between multiple ENs. So app might be something which we can start thinking about, but near to reality is having your own account, entering the data, and getting everything done at one place. So this is something which we have planned, and it is happening at the back end, where we are working very hard as a team. So we hope to release this particular feature very soon with all of you.
So you should be able to connect to your data, and you can now already. We've launched dynamic benchmarking, which isn't kind of focused necessarily on beans, but we put all of the data together across all the beans. So particularly for the grain nutrition type stuff, for previous years, this year's data is not on there yet, but it will be. You can, if you register to the Yen website as a user, then any past data, you can access it and kind of then see your results, select your fields, and then compare yourself to data, but not just the whole data set, just by soil type or by crop type or by region. And that's one of the things we wanted to expand in Farm Pep, is kind of making that something which we could ultimately we could put all of the metrics that we're talking about online, so that rather than just comparing them in a on a PDF document or on a bit of paper, you can actually interact with it and choose who you compare yourself to.
Yeah, I just provided a brief view of what Dan has been sharing. So I also have shared the link. So if you are keen to give it a try, it's available right now, and it has all the data, as Dan mentioned, from previous years apart from 2021, which will be added very soon as well. You can filter the crop based on crop region, soil, year, or nutrition, grain nutrition, that is. So all of these features is available right away. You can just try it after switching off from this meeting or over the weekend.
You just need to use the same email address that you'll have used with us in the past. That's how it recognises.
Yeah, that's true. So please make sure, in case if you can't connect to your past data, please feel free to email Tom, me, Dan, or one of the Yen email addresses, and we will connect your email address or update your email address, because your data is connected with your email address, which was used at the time of the entry.
Okay, well, we're slowly clicking towards 1 o'clock, and I'm anxious that we don't try and keep people longer than they've subscribed for in the first place. So it just remains me to thank firstly all the growers for participating, and the sponsors, equally importantly, for supporting those growers, and any agronomists who've been supporting both. To thank ADAS and my colleagues at PGRO for the hard work that's gone into basically crunching all the numbers and bringing the presentations together. And I hope that we can look forward to everybody who participated this year participating next year, and perhaps us having twice as many on this meeting in 2022. Again, final reminder, there are no stupid questions. Anybody who wants to have any information about this year's Yen, previous Yens, suggestions for next year's Yens, please just contact us. we'll be very, very pleased to hear from you. And yeah, I'm very sorry once again that we couldn't be all together in one room, but I think we'll sign this meeting off, and I wish you all a very happy Christmas, and see you all in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, folks.
Stop recording.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Stop recording.
I'll do it as well.